Okay, let's dive in. Welcome to the deep dive. You hand us a stack of sources and, well, our job is to sift through it all. Find those key insights, the surprises, the stuff you really need to know.
Exactly. Cut through the noise, basically.
And today, we're tackling some research you sent over. It's about a pretty fascinating scientific discovery. Feels a bit like a detective story, actually.
It really does. We're looking at findings from the University of Colorado Boulder, and it's a great example of how science often works, you know? You're looking for A or B, and suddenly the data throws you this curveball, something totally unexpected.
And that curveball is really what this deep dive is about. The source mentions this team. They're using this really sensitive equipment.
State-of-the-art stuff.
Right, and they weren't even specifically looking for this pollutant. But they end up making the first ever detection of a toxic airborne chemical, MCCPs, here in the Western Hemisphere. Found it somewhere pretty surprising, too.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't the main goal, but the tools they had were just so good, they picked up these signals that, well, they just didn't expect to see there.
So our mission today, let's unpack this. What did these CU Boulder researchers actually find? Where? How did they figure it out? And where might it be coming from? Crucially, why does this discovery matter for you?
Okay, let's start with that core finding. The University of Colorado Boulder team reported the very first airborne detection of these medium chain chlorinated paraffins, MCCPs, anywhere in the Western Hemisphere's atmosphere.
And the location, that's really key, isn't it? This wasn't like downtown LA or Houston.
No, not at all. Rural Oklahoma. They were actually there to study something else entirely, how tiny atmospheric particles form and grow, using this nitrate chemical ionization mass spectrometer. Really fundamental atmospheric science.
Okay, so they're looking at particle formation.
Right, and that's when this completely unexpected signal pops up in their data. Daniel Ketz, he's a chemistry PhD student at CU Boulder, the lead author. He's quoted saying, "It was very exciting as a scientist to find something unexpected like this that we weren't looking for." And he points out, now that we know this pollutant is actually in our air, well, we really need to understand it better. Urgently.
Okay, MCCPs, what are they exactly?
Yeah.
The source calls them a type of toxic organic pollutant.
That's right. And they're getting more attention globally. They're actually under consideration right now for regulation by the Stockholm Convention.
Oh, wow. That's the big international treaty, right, for persistent organic pollutants.
Exactly. It aims to protect health and the environment from these widespread, long-lasting chemicals. So, yeah, being considered there is a pretty big deal.
And the source says they have been found elsewhere. Antarctica? Asia?
Yeah, traces have shown up in remote places, which tells you something about their persistence and ability to travel. But actually documenting them in the air here in the Western Hemisphere, that was completely new.
And these aren't just some obscure lab chemicals you mentioned.
No, the source mentions common uses. Things like fluids for metalworking, and they're used in making PVC plastics and textiles, too.
Okay, so industrial processes, everyday materials.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to the puzzle. How does something used in metalworking end up floating in the air over rural Oklahoma?
Right. And the researchers have a leading hypothesis, which is pretty eye-opening.
Okay.
They strongly suspect that the MCCPs they found came from biosolid fertilizer. You know, it's often called sewage sludge.
Wait, sewage sludge. How would these chemicals even get into sewage sludge?
Well, think about it. Because MCCPs are in all those industrial and consumer products, they inevitably end up going down the drain into wastewater systems. And biosolid fertilizer is literally made from the solid stuff that's left over after wastewater treatment.
Okay. So wastewater comes in from everywhere, gets treated, the solids become this biosolid fertilizer. And then what? How does it get airborne?
So the hypothesis is when that sewage sludge, that biosolid fertilizer, is spread on farm fields, which is a really common practice.
Yeah, happens all over.
These toxic compounds could then be released into the air. Maybe they evaporate, volatilize, or maybe they get kicked up as dust or attached to small particles.
Wow, okay. That connects the dots, though maybe not in a way people usually think about air pollution sources. The source quotes Daniel Ketz on this.
It does. He acknowledges, you know, this study didn't directly prove that link, like catching it in the act of moving from sludge to air, but he calls it a reasonable way that they could be winding up in the air. He also notes that other studies have found similar compounds being released from sewage sludge fertilizers. So there's precedent.
Right. And this connects to something else the source brought up, this idea of like unintended consequences when you regulate chemicals.
Exactly. It talks about MCCPs, little cousins, the short-chain chlorinated paraffins, or SCCPs.
And those are already regulated, right? Stockholm Convention, EPA, here in the U.S. since, what, 2009?
Correct. And that regulation happened because SCCPs were found to be toxic. They stick around for a long time, and they can travel really far through the atmosphere. All the warning signs.
So what's the unintended consequence part?
Well, the researchers proposed that regulating SCCPs might have actually inadvertently led to more MCCPs being used. Basically, industry needed something to replace the regulated SCCPs in their products.
So they potentially switched to the very similar but unregulated MCCPs.
That's the hypothesis. It's a common issue in chemical regulation. Ellie Brown, she's a co-author, CU Boulder chemistry professor. She's quoted on this. She says, "We always have these unintended consequences. You regulate something, and then there's still a need for the products, so they get replaced by something." It really shows how tricky managing these things can be.
Yeah, it's like playing chemical whack-a-mole sometimes.
Kind of. And Katz also noted another similarity. MCCPs behave a bit like PFAS, the forever chemicals.
Because they break down really slowly.
Exactly. They're persistent, which makes that connection to Oklahoma even more relevant because the source mentions that just recently, the Oklahoma Senate actually banned biosolid fertilizer.
Oh, really? What?
Because of concerns about PFAS contamination in soils. So while this MCCP study didn't cause that ban, it definitely highlights this ongoing issue around contaminants in biosolids and how they might move into the environment, including the air.
Okay, so it adds another layer of concern to that whole pathway. So how did they actually pin down that it was MCCPs in the air? You mentioned the fancy instrument.
Right, the nitrate chemical ionization mass spectrometer. And they weren't just taking spot samples. They were measuring the air at that farm site 24/7 for a whole month.
Wow, that's a ton of data.
A massive amount. And Daniel Katz was meticulously going through it all, cataloging the chemical signals. That's when he started noticing these really distinct patterns, specific isotopic signatures.
Stuff that didn't match the usual suspect.
Exactly. Signals that were, anomalies. They didn't fit anything they expected to find there. So he had to dig deeper, compare these unknown patterns to databases of known chemical structures.
And bingo.
They matched the profile for chlorinated paraffins, specifically the ones found in MCCPs. That was the breakthrough moment. Real chemical detective work.
That combination of high-tech gear and just painstaking data analysis is pretty cool. So what happens now? What are the next steps?
Well, the researchers say a key next step is to measure these pollutants at different times of the year.
To see if levels change seasonally? Maybe track it with fertilizer application times.
That seems like a very logical thing to look into, yeah.
Yeah.
But they also emphasize, look, finding them is just step one. There's still a lot we don't know. Katz points out, we still don't know exactly what they do when they are in the atmosphere. They need to be investigated further.
So we know they're there, but what happens next? How do they react? Where do they end up? What's the actual health impact? Lots more questions.
Precisely. And Katz kind of brings it back to the bigger policy picture. He says, I think it's important that we continue to have governmental agencies that are capable of evaluating the science and regulating these chemicals as necessary for public health and safety. This kind of study feeds directly into that process.
Absolutely. And just for anyone wanting to check the source, the study was published in ACS Environmental O, June 5th, 2025. Daniel John Katz and Eleanor C. Brown are among the authors.
Right. So if we boil it down, this deep dive uncovered this really surprising detection of a toxic chemical, MCCPs, floating in the air over the U.S.
First time documented here.
First time documented here, yeah. And potentially linked, through a plausible pathway anyway, to a really common practice, using biosolid fertilizer from wastewater treatment.
It's such a stark reminder of how science works, isn't it?
Yeah.
You go looking for one thing, maybe atmospheric particle formation, and you stumble onto something completely different, but potentially really important for environmental health.
Definitely. A new piece of the puzzle revealed almost by accident. But as they say, this is really just the beginning. Understanding what these MCCPs are doing up there, that's the next big chapter.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, based just on what we've discussed from this source material. Just think about the hidden connections. How something routine, like wastewater treatment or fertilizing a field, might connect to the wider atmosphere in ways we're only just starting to uncover, sending chemicals on journeys we never really expected.